If you're a fan of The Crown, we're sure you've binged the show's fifth and penultimate season by now. One of the best things about the show was the inside look we got into the closely guarded affairs of the royal family. But the show does take artistic license with things. In this video, we're gonna quickly go over things that the show portrayed accurately and some things where they went off the beaten track. Let's begin with the things the show got right, starting with the saga of the infamous Princess Diana interview. For starters, the show did a pretty bang-on job of recreating the interview itself. It's a testament to Elizabeth Debicki's acting prowess that you could splice in footage of the actual interview in the middle of Debicki's version and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. But the story of how that interview came to be was pretty spicy too, and it was all true. We see on The Crown that Martin Bashir gets in touch with Diana and her brother Earl and starts telling them stories of the Queen and her spies tracking their every move. He also forges a number of bank statements showing that the Windsors were making payments to members of their personal staff through shell companies. This convinces Diana to go on the offensive, taking the hot seat on Panorama to air all of her and Charles's dirty laundry. It sounds too lurid to be true, but it was, folks. Back in November 2020, during the interview's 25th anniversary, BBC Director General Tim Curry apologized to Earl for Martin's lies and forged bank statements. Thanks to an investigation led by former Supreme Court Justice John Dyson, Bashir was found guilty of deceit and breaching BBC editorial conduct. Bashir had resigned from the BBC for health reasons ahead of the revelations, and that was the end of his journalism career. Up next, we can confirm that Prince Philip really was one of the coolest carriage drivers ever. Early in Season 5, we see that Prince Philip is developing a new hobby for himself, carriage driving. He has a whole carriage driving club and everything. This might sound like a stereotypical thing that a bored rich British person would do, but in reality, this was a serious passion of Philip's. Not only was he a hobbyist, the guy even competed on an international level as part of the British driving team. You can also read his books on the subject, and the Prince Consort was even the president of the Federation Equestre Internationale. Also true was his friendship with Penelope Knatchbull, a fellow carriage driver. He'd been seen hanging out with her in real life. The British press even insinuated that the prince was having an affair with her. Apparently, their only evidence was that royal affairs were in vogue in the 90s. But Knatchbull was a super close friend of Philip's, and she was one of only 30 people invited to his private funeral. Another true fact was the fire that damaged large parts of Windsor Castle. As the cherry on top of Queen Elizabeth's Annus Horribilis, a single year in which everything that could possibly went wrong, a massive fire broke out in Windsor Castle, an official residence of the Windsor family. Most screenwriters would throw in a scene like this to underline the overarching theme of the season. The House of Windsor is burning down. But did that actually happen? Well, life really does imitate art, because a fire damaged large parts of Windsor Castle at the end of 1992. The conflagration started when a spotlight made contact with a curtain and set it on fire. And thanks to the building's old wooden structure, the castle was quickly ablaze. It took 15 hours to stop the fire, and there were 6 minor injuries to humans. In terms of property damage, though, the list is quite long. The Crimson Drawing Room, the Green Drawing Room, and the Queen's private chapel were all destroyed, as was the ceiling of St. George's Hall. There were also considerable damage to the state dining room of the Prince of Wales Tower, and the Grand Reception Room among 100 total rooms. This doesn't even include all of the valuable artifacts and artwork destroyed in the fire. It cost the Windsors £36.5 million and 5 years to repair and restore everything, though the stuff that was destroyed couldn't be recovered. And finally, the Camilla Gate call was also unfortunately true. So we all know that the Prince of Wales, who's now known as King Charles III, had an affair with Camilla Parker Bowles. You don't need to be convinced that the two of them used to talk to each other on the phone, and you can surely believe that one of the calls was intercepted and leaked to the press. But the script reenacted by Dominic West and Olivia Williams was just way too crazy to be legit, right? There was so much weirdness in it that it had to be satire. Yeah, no. While the show doesn't include the complete transcript of the call, the stuff you hear is all in there. The King of England did indeed tell the Queen that he wished he could be her tampon, and he did also lament the fact that this would mean he'd be circling the toilet when flushed. The Crown actually undersold the British public's reaction to this scandal. There were loud protests demanding Charles abdicate his claim to the throne. Now, we're making fun of Charles here because he's a goof, but we get that this is how we speak to the people we love sometimes. Camilla was practically the only one he could open up to in this way, and so he did. Heavy is the head that wears the crown, after all. Now, let's talk about some of the show's inaccuracies, starting with the relationship between the Queen and Winston Churchill. That's right, we're going all the way back to Season 1 for this. It's been so long and so much has happened on The Crown that you might have forgotten that John Lithgow once brought his acting chops to Britain's most formidable prime minister. The show has always showcased the relationship between the Queen and all the prime ministers she worked with, and it portrayed her relationship with Churchill as strained. The Churchill we see on the show is a common take on his character. He's a gruff and no-nonsense man, willing to take hard solutions to difficult situations. That's the kind of man you'd expect to be Britain's World War II prime minister. But actually, he had a real sense of humor to him, and he was reasonably fun to be with. Queen Elizabeth once confessed that her first prime minister was her favorite due to his fun-loving personality. Up next is the Queen's approach to the Aberfan disaster. In 1966, a coal slide in Aberfan, South Wales, destroyed the Pentglass Junior School and killed 144 people, a tragic 116 of whom were children. This turned out to be Queen Elizabeth's first misfire as Britain's sovereign, as even though Prince Philip visited Aberfan at the time, it took the Queen over a week to do the same. In the show, this is portrayed as Elizabeth just not being concerned enough to go and address the people there. This is a bit unfair to the Queen. While we don't know why the Queen waited so long to go there, it could be chalked up to her being inexperienced with these kinds of situations. She would later go on to say that her handling of the Aberfan disaster was the greatest regret of her long reign, showing that she knew enough to know that she'd made a mistake back then. Let's move on from Queen Elizabeth and talk about someone else, like Margaret Thatcher. One of the major events covered in the later seasons of The Crown is the Falklands War. In 1982, Argentina and the United Kingdom came to blows over two British territories that the former said belonged to them. At about the same time, as we see in The Crown, Prime Minister Thatcher's son went missing in the Sahara Desert. His disappearance is depicted as one of the motivations for Thatcher's decision to counter Argentina's aggression. But this is just another case of the show's dramatic license. Mark Thatcher disappeared in the Sahara Desert, but he was found after 6 days in January. Meanwhile, the Falklands conflict didn't start until 3 months after Mark returned to the UK, so clearly, that was not the reason for the war. In reality, Argentina's closeness to the islands allowed them to take the initiative and quickly seize military control of the Falklands, South Georgia, and the South Sandwich Islands. Now, since Britain maintains that those islands are its territory, it couldn't not respond to the invasion. The British motivation behind the war was as simple as that, although a conspiracy and a kidnapping underlying the whole thing sure make this story sizzle. Finally, we'll address Queen Mary's decision on the fate of the Romanovs. In an episode of the 5th season, we briefly travel back to World War I. During the reign of King George V and Queen Mary, the October Revolution saw the Bolsheviks overthrow the Tsar's empire in Russia. The new communist regime began executing anyone and everyone associated with the Tsar. So Tsar Nicholas II reached out to the British Crown for help. Queen Mary is the one who ultimately decides not to give the Tsar's family refuge in the UK, leaving them to stay there and wait for the communists to brutally execute them. Now, the Romanovs were cousins to the British royals, and King George V did consider their plight. However, there's no proof or record that it was Queen Mary's decision to basically leave the Romanovs to die. Once again, the show is taking dramatic license by sort of filling in a gap in the story. Queen Mary's decision here is referenced by Queen Elizabeth later in the episode to indirectly justify her own approach to ruling the kingdom. That whole message of heavy is the head that wears the crown doesn't really work in this context without that invented detail. Peter Morgan would probably argue that we don't know that Queen Mary didn't make the decision to leave the Romanovs to die. And you know, fair play to him. That's it for today's video. What do you think of the Crown's track record for accuracy? What other moments in history did the show get right or wrong? Let us know in the comments section below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.